Today we want to talk about the burden of leadership, the weight of leadership. Almost everyone in ministry loves the work of the ministry. It's the weight of the ministry that becomes a burden and becomes difficult to carry. And today I was reading Psalm 55, once again, reading it not intentionally, but reading it with a leadership lens. And I began to see some of how to navigate, or really how to think like a leader regarding the burden of spiritual leadership. And I want to read just one verse at the beginning, and then we'll backtrack and fill in the gaps of what it is saying. Psalm 55, verse 22. Cast your burden on the Lord, and He will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. Now that cast your burden on the Lord, that kind of sounds like some New Testament ideas we'll get to in a moment. Cast your burden. What is the burden? When we think about this idea of the burden a leader carries, this is David, who had a lot of leadership burden, all types, from being a spiritual leader and a worship leader and a songwriter and all of the spiritual aspect of David's leadership and the musicianship and the psalmist, also to military burdens that he carried as a military leader. He didn't try to be a military leader. He was just kept getting promoted to becoming the king. There was all levels of leadership in David's life. And so here he's writing, cast your burden. Now that's the end of the Psalm. It only has 23 verses, but what he has is the first 21 verses are explaining the burden. They're describing the burden that he's saying cast it on the Lord. He's giving the solution here. But what we see basically, it's all categorized the way I read it into two types of burdens. Two heavy burdens that leaders and especially spiritual leaders carry, but we don't need to carry it. We need to cast it instead of carry it. Cast it on the Lord instead of carrying the burden ourselves. Here they are. There's not only two types of burdens, but also two responses to those burdens. And when we realize we're carrying a heavy weight of a burden as a leader, there are two ways to go with that. And we'll see that in the text. So again, verses 1 through 21 describe these two types of burdens. The first one is what is described here in verse 3. He says, or let's go back to 1. Give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not yourself from my plea for mercy. Attend to me and answer me. I am restless in my complaint, and I moan because. This restlessness, this crying out to God, this being driven to prayer, this desperation before God is because of this. Verse 3, because of the noise of the enemy. The first burden we carry as leaders is the noise of the enemy. And then he goes on to describe that because of the oppression of the wicked. For they drop trouble upon me. In anger, they bear a grudge against me. Look at these words. The noise of the enemy. What is that? It's oppression of the wicked. It's trouble. It's anger. It's grudges. Have you felt that as a leader? Have you felt the anger of people who disagree with you? Have you felt the oppression of the wickedness in our culture? Have you felt people who have a grudge against you, something they won't let go of, whether you were wrong or whether you were right, but they're holding it against you? That's the noise of the enemy. He goes on down in verse 4 and further describes this noise of the enemy. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. So think about this. This is an internal weight and an external weight. He says there's anguish inside of me, but something has come from the outside and fallen on me. There's something from external that's falling on me, and there's something internally. That is this weight, this burden, especially that comes from the noise of the enemy. Then he describes it, verse 5. So he says there's anguish, there's terrors. Verse 5, there's fear, trembling, horror, feeling overwhelmed. This is all the noise of the enemy, the burden we carry. I don't know where it comes from. Maybe it's a psychological idea. Maybe it's a self-help idea. I don't know. But I've heard it said that when we face something like this noise of the enemy, or like this oppression of the wicked, or like this internal trouble and anguish and all these things, then we tend to, as humans, either freeze, we just get stuck in the moment and don't know what to do, or fight, or flee. So the freeze, the fight, or the flee. So what David says here is the flee option. All right. He says when all this is happening, this noise of the enemy, this anguish, terror, fear, trembling, horror, overwhelming nature of all of this, he says this, and I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove, I would fly away and be at rest. The only problem with that is some of it's internal. He says there's anguish within me that comes from this noise of the enemy. So if he flies away, he's taking what's inside with him. That's what ends up happening if we flee. So he says, I would fly away, verse 7, yes, I would wander far away. And so sometimes we think the answer is fly away, far away. Let's just somehow get away from this. And so that's the reaction we have, but it's probably not helpful in terms of thinking like a leader and how we should deal with the burden. But the second burden, so he says, cast your burdens on the Lord, but he spent 21 verses describing the burden. So he's described this noise of the enemy burden. But look at verse 12. He goes on, and as he's describing fleeing and wanting to get away and running away, verse 12, for it is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me, then I could hide from him. But he goes on, he says, but as you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend, we used to take sweet counsel together within God's house. We walked in the throng. And so he's describing one, there's the noise of the enemy, and he describes that. And he thinks, oh, if I can only flee. But he says, but I can't do that because it's not just an enemy, it's a friend, a familiar friend, a companion. The second burden of leadership, which is extremely exponentially weightier than the noise of the enemy, and it is the betrayal of a friend. And that's what David's describing here. And then he goes on in verse 20. My companion stretched out his hand against his friends. He violated his covenant. This is this betrayal of friends. His speech, listen to this, his speech was smooth as butter, yet war was in his heart. Have you ever been around people like that who were close and spoke words that were smooth, and yet there was a war in their heart. You knew it, something was not right. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. So this first weight and burden of leadership is the noise of the enemy, but the more weighty burden that leaders, especially spiritual leaders, end up really carrying and being crushed by is the betrayal of friends. So what do we do about it? The first solution he gave, and it's not a good solution, is just flee. If I could just fly away, if I could get far away, let me just go somewhere and everything will be okay. No, not really. That gets us to verse 22, the end of this psalm. After describing this anguish, this betrayal, all of this going on internally and externally, David comes to this conclusion, this instruction, this solution. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. Don't carry the burden, cast the burden. Throw the burden off. Throw it on the Lord. It reminds me, of course, of 1 Peter 5:7. And this, again, think like a leader. This is a word for leaders. Here's what Peter said, casting all your anxieties, I believe the NIV says your cares, on the Lord because he cares for you. A lot of times as leaders, we apply that to people in our congregations, people who look to us for leadership as if our job is to teach them how to cast their cares. But what about the cares we're carrying, the anxieties we're carrying, the weight of ministry and the weight of leadership and the burden of leadership? So if you want to think like a leader, when you think about the weight of ministry and the burden of leadership, then what you do is you cast it on the Lord. You're not designed to carry weight. You're not a pack animal. You are designed to walk in freedom from the burden and from the weight. So I want to encourage every leader, cast the leadership weight, the noise of the enemy and the betrayal of friends and companions, cast it on the Lord. Don't carry it.